et tous.
Hello, good morning to all of you. Welcome to the second day of the International Symposium Elles font l'abstraction, Women in Abstraction. Before I begin to present you with the content of the session that brings us together this morning, I would like to inform you that the symposium is entirely bilingual. You can choose your audio channel in the bottom bar of the interface and access, therefore, the simultaneous translation. Furthermore, I will ask you to ask your questions in the Q&A tab rather than in the chat room, which is reserved to other types of contents. And I would like to inform you that as a moderator of this session, I will relay your written questions to our three speakers. And I will do so during a time of exchanges, which will follow the presentations of the people who will speak this morning. And therefore, I would like to add that you can ask you the questions in the language you wish. With these technical details settled now, I will move on to the contents. This second study morning was supposed to open with a few words from Jean-Max Collard, head of the Chef du Service de la Parole, Department of Culture and Creation at the Centre Pompidou. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us this morning. He regrets it very much, but wanted me to say a few words on his behalf. And so this is what I'm going to begin with. As you may have read in the program, the second morning of the International Symposium Elles font l'abstraction, Women in Abstraction, is devoted to PhD session. That is to say that this half-day session welcomes contributions from young researchers, and this is something that Jean-Max Collard and his department were very keen on. To make heard the current research seemed to him all the more relevant that the question of the place of women artists today is, to repeat his words, of burning topicality. And this is also the reason why the doctoral sessions or PhD sessions, the one today and the one that will be held tomorrow morning, are integrated within the symposium rather than constituting an independent day or a separate day. He also wanted to specify that the speakers you will hear this morning have been subjected to the same selection as the other speakers of the symposium, since they have sent their proposals for contributions to the same scientific committee. This committee was composed, I will remind you, of Christine Massel and Carolina Lewandowska from the Centre Pompidou, Camille Morino and Matilda Taziska from the AWARE Association, as well as Éric de Chasset, Charlotte Fouché-Zarmagnan, Abigail Solomon-Godot, and Valérie Dacosta. This is to say that all the speakers you will hear this morning were chosen for the relevance and the interest of their current research. Finally, Jean-Max Collard wanted to emphasize that the organization of the PhD sessions were done with the support of the UPL, University of Paris Lumière, which brings together three institutions, the CNRS, the University of Paris 8 Vincennes Saint-Denis, and the University of Paris-Nanterre. And it is therefore in this capacity that I'm speaking, since as a doctoral student in philosophy of art at the University of Paris 8, I have been associated to the organization of this conference. I therefore take the floor in my own name now to welcome you to this first doctoral or PhD session organized by the Centre Pompidou, the AWARE Association, and the LEGS being the Laboratory for Studies of Gender and Sexuality that brings together researchers from the CNRS, University of Paris 8 Vincennes, and University of Paris-Nanterre. I warmly thank Jean-Max Collard and his team at the Centre Pompidou for their invitation and to give voice to young researchers within this framework. And I also warmly thank Marie-Chanel and Eleni Pontelajas from the AWARE Association, in particular for having introduced us to the speakers who will be taking the floor today. So we have decided to call this half-day session Beyond Painting, Theory, Textile, Art, and Dance. It is, in its spirit, it echoes the exhibition Elles font l'abstraction, Women in Abstraction, for which the curators, Christine Massel and Karolina Lewandowska, have endeavored to present a history of abstraction extended to dance, decorative arts, photography, and film. As the device of the oral presentations allows it, we can further broaden the perspective by adding to these multiple artistic practice a theoretical reflection. We know that women artists were the first creators of non-conceptualized abstraction with the rise of spiritualism in the 1850s. And here I refer to, I hope you will have been able to see the work of the exhibition of Georgiana Houghton, a British artist born in 1814, who produced her abstract watercolors during spiritual trances. But if some women have practiced abstraction in a way that could be described as intuitive, others have very quickly thought about this new language in terms of art history and have written about it. And this is the case of the painters Louise Jamin and Laure Garcin, whose theoretical contributions Marion Sergent will present to us in the first presentation, entitled Abstractions of the 1930s, when the painters Louise Jamin and Laure Garcin became theorists. So these two artists worked in the 30s. The artist that Franny Tachon will present to us in a second presentation exhibited in the 1970s. This enlarged or widened temporal framework, which corresponds to that of the exhibition shown at the Centre Pompidou, has its importance concerning the opening of abstract art to extra pictorial disciplines, since the different periods correspond to different strategies on the part of women artists, and the relationship to gender and the place reserved to this question of gender within the practices is not the same according to the periods. And we will see through in the second presentation, which is entitled Sorority, Textile and Abstraction, the demonstrations, Soon Space, Soon Painting of Aline Dallier-Popper, 1976-1977, that the inclusion of the textile in abstraction at this moment of history is charged of political intention. Finally, we must also to introduce disciplines outside the pictorial fields in the definition of abstraction, think not only in terms of long temporality, but also in terms of widened geographical area. And this is what Lou Forster will invite us to do through a third and final communication, which is called Dancing Page in Hand, incorporating abstraction in the Lucinda Childs Dance Company, 1973-78. With Lou Forster, we will cross the Atlantic, but we will see above all that if the existence of an American artistic scene was a source of tension in Europe after the war, it was also the starting point for numerous circulations and presentations. And these influences between artists also explain the plurality of forms and abstraction. So here is the schedule for this session, during which we will listen to three presentations, and after which we will have a time for discussion, normally around 11:25 if we are on time. And therefore, I invite the listeners to send their questions in the Q&A thread, specifying, if possible, the name of the speaker to whom the question is addressed, so that I can forward it to the right person, and at the end of the three speeches. I now suggest to start with Marion Sergent's presentation, who is pleased to be with us today, even though she just presented her thesis only 2 weeks ago. I thank her for this. Marion Sergent studied at the Sorbonne University, and her research work was on musical artists. More precisely, her thesis was entitled Les artistes musicalistes, théorie et pratique d'une union des arts, 1930 to 1960. And it is thus this question of the relation between theory and music in Laure Garcin and in Louise Janin's work that she is going to deploy to us now. And I'd like to point out that Marion Sergent will soon publish a book on Louise Janin with the Hippocampe editor, the editor. So Marion Sergent, I give you the floor now.
Castel, je tiens à vous remercier
Thank you
ainsi
so much, Oriane. And I want to really thank you and all the organizers of the conference, be it Aware, the Pompidou Center, the Legs Laboratory. So thank you for welcoming me today. I just share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint.
Normalement, vous voyez bien, j'espère. Parfait. Alors, comme cela a pu vous être dit,
As it was said, my presentation focuses on two women artists, women painters, Louise Janin and Laure Garcin. The first, as her name doesn't show, is American, North American. She was born in 1893 and she died in 1997. The second is French. She's 3 years younger than her colleague and born in 1896 and died in 1978. So we see that their lives offer a nice, or cover most of the 20th century. But I'll be focusing on a precise moment of their trajectory, the 1930s, because that's the moment where both have swapped the brush for the pen. And they both published at the time texts questioning the notion of abstract art while they were present on the Paris art scene. And the study of these texts will enable us to better understand how the idea of abstract art could be perceived in the 30s, a decade that is often not insisted on in the narratives on abstraction. But before I mention these common themes to these artists, I'll give you some biographical elements because Janin and Garcin are not well known, and it'll enable us to better understand the evolution that led them to join modern circles of the Paris art scene in the interwar years. How and why were they interested in abstract art while their early works were very far from the research of the avant-garde? I'll start with Louise Janin. These are the two earliest works of hers that are known to us, the Division of the Bamboo Grove and Mandara. That was done in the 1910s, and they were exposed at the Palace of Fine Arts of San Francisco, where Janin grew up. And these paintings are representative of Janin's early works because they're inspired by Far Eastern philosophies. After a few trips, Louise Janin settled in Paris at the end of 1923. And her exhibition the following year at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery shows a large body inspired by Far Eastern philosophies. But one can also notice her decorative style, the ornamental richness of her works. And this ornamentation will become more and more autonomous in Janin's work. And it's visible in her 1928 exhibition at the Georges Petit Gallery. And we can see some titles emerging that betray that decoration element. Titles like composition, rhythm, or decorative interpretation. Two examples in a painting called Ballet from 1927-28, or in the Portrait d'Armand de Polignac from the same period. One sees that the spirals, the sinuous lines, are not restricted to the fabric or furniture, as was the case in her previous works, but come suggest the movement of the dancers or the sounds of the piano. So decorative motives are freed from a figurative pretext, if you like. Her meeting in 1926 with one of the abstraction pioneers, Francesca Kupka, whom she greatly admired, certainly plays a part in this evolution. She also met at the same time the painter Henri Valency, who was the secretary of the Salon de la Section d'Or in 1912. And Rancy invites Janin in 1932 to join the Association of Musicalist Artists that is just created with Charles Blancati, Gustave Bourgogne, and Vito Stracquadaini. An association that wants to bring together all those who obey the laws of inspiration and composition of music, which is currently predominant in the arts. Janin attends the exhibitions of the groups, attends the evenings at Avanti Studio, evenings that attract artists at the heart of the avant-garde. Robert Anthony Delaunay, Kupka, Valentine Prax, Albert Gleizes, Juliette Roche, or Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. And that brief overview of the early career of Janin gives us some clues on why she had this shift towards abstraction, and between inverted commas, because we should try to avoid the myth of a progressist evolution that can only tend to non-figuration, as we'll see a little further on. Concerning Laure Garcin, she turns to art after the 1418 war, after the Great War, trained in singing, theatre, and painting, and she'll finally dedicate herself to painting. She studies from 1919 to the Académie Julian before joining the Beaux-Arts in Paris, the fine arts. From the time, we have a few copies of antique monuments that show, that testify of her academic training. And we can also see the paintings from the time. There's a paysage from the Jura on the slide, a still life, or an anachronism in that realistic treatment of that painting on the right-hand side. And her judgment on her career, or on the beginning of the career, is very harsh later. And she says, "I won't be childish and deny that at the start of my work as a painter, I thought it necessary to explore the forms proposed by the outside world. And I wanted to know the body that taught, as it was said, the so-called realistic painting that is the École des Beaux-Arts." And she's very critical on the Beaux-Arts in Paris. What's interesting is that in the early 30s, we'll see that she assimilates the avant-garde currents, notably the geometrization of cubist forms before turning to abstract art. And that period of 1933 is very interesting because of the diversity of the style she explores. We go from the atelier, the studio on the left-hand side with a figurative, realistic style, to a still life in the middle, where one can see that she's inspired by the cubist treatment, or the purist treatment of Léger aux Beaux Enfants. See her self-portrait that's extremely stylized, and that she did in 1932, or dated in 1932, the same year as the movement, where we can see a mechanist aesthetic that refers to another Léger than the purist Léger, if you like, or an abstract composition, which is totally non-figurative. And I use the dates and the notes that I found, so we see a nice linear evolution. So maybe that's a little fabricated, or maybe they were the actual dates. However, what's important here is that that moment of the early 30s, when she explores all these styles, corresponds to the moment when Garcin joins the avant-garde milieu of the Paris art scene, taking part in 1931 to the exhibition by the Association 1940 with Robert Delaunay, Fernand Léger, that highlights abstract art before taking part in abstraction creation the following year, as testifies a small text that she writes and that was published in the journal of the group in 1932. So be it Garcin or Janin, the two artists who are gravitating in modern circles, in abstract art circles, both witnessing that context of abstraction in the late 20s or early 30s, and experimenting non-figurative formulas in their paintings. And the text of both artists are not so much a theory of their personal practice, but more a reflection on the situation of abstract art while trying to theorize it better or even go beyond it. And what is striking is to see the similarity of the observations and solutions that they defend in their writings. In the communication, I've selected 4 points that I find enlightening for this presentation. The 4 points are first the acknowledgement of an academism of abstract art, well, way before Charles Etienne. The second is the fact that they want to go beyond rigid formulas. They no longer want to oppose abstraction and figuration. They want a synthesis. And thirdly, they have a similar conception of the expressive function of art, and they use the notion of symbol and the notion of universal language, and they have a historical vision of abstraction. They nearly propose a prehistory of abstraction by going back very far in time. So let's start by the first point, the acknowledgement of an academism of abstract art before Charles Etienne. I'm thinking of Charles Etienne's text in 1950, who was asking, is abstract art an academism? Where he criticizes certain dogmatic positions and a formalist conception of abstraction as an arrangement of geometric shapes. 3 years before, an issue of Cahiers d'Art asks another question, for or against abstract art. So one could believe that one has to wait 1950 for the debate on abstraction to shift, going from the fight between the figuratives and the abstract artists to disagreements among abstract artists. Of course, these two questions, one should not see these questions one after the other. They cohabited in the questioning of abstract artists, sorry, as shown by the debates within groups of the 1930s. And Garcin and Janin try to answer those two questions at the same time. And regarding dogmatism, let's see what she says, or what they say. In a conference that she gave in 1937, Garcin says that pioneering abstract research were necessary, and that it is an important tendency and that has questioned visual and spiritual values, but she also acknowledged some dogmatism, as one can see in the quote that I'm proposing. I won't try to defend the attitude of a few painters of that school, the abstract school, who have not gone beyond that experience and who have fixed their position after the encompassing disciplines of the first period of the so-called abstract art. Resuming endlessly those experimentations was a mistake, because any dogmatism in art very quickly becomes a negation of art. And her communication ends on the idea that tomorrow's art cannot be a repeat, and I quote, of the formulas of cubism or non-figurative art. And the term of formula is significant, and it betrays the idea of established recipes, of hackneyed methods, of a codification that can only lead to a sterile academism, as she explains in another text published in 1946 in Les Temps Modernes. And in that article, there again, she acknowledges the fact that abstract art shows signs of exhaustion, continuous repetitions, poor invention, an obvious lack of invention, and that doesn't go beyond the inconsequential arrangements of the kaleidoscope that children play with. We'll see the same criticism with Louis Janin, who was early in 1929, condemns the work of some abstractionists with their trusty compass and ruler. And she used the same phrase again 2 years later. How can one substitute to prodigal nature as a source of inspiration the architect compass or the ruler that had become a crutch for the staggering cubist siren? That expression of an art that's made with a compass or a ruler that she uses to designate neoclassicist works shows the rejection of a geometrical abstraction that would be empty of meaning, of expressiveness, that would only be a formal play. I won't read the quote that I put on the screen, but I just remember that last sentence: thirst for nothingness or painting for robots, which shows that she refuses an abstraction empty of signification. Later, Jana will defend abstraction, but she will mostly defend the abstraction of the musicalist group and of Kupka's. But she cautions against falling into a sterile, soul-destroying backwards academism. We can see that their positions anticipate those of Charles Etienne's in the way they condemn a formalist conception of abstract art and characterized by a creation process that is too methodical, too codified, generating geometrical works empty of emotion. What is also interesting in these quotes is the association made between cubism and non-figuration by these artists. One could be surprised by it today, but what should remember that among groups like Cercle Carré or abstraction creation, there are many former cubists, but especially as Marie-Aline Prat points out, we must remember that abstract art in France in the 30s is very much under the model of cubism. And so regarding the going beyond rigid formulas, Jean and Garcin acknowledge frozen abstract art in their texts, and what solution do they envisage? Against modernists, abstractionists, but also against academics, Jana advocates an art of the in-between that takes different forms. First, a refusal to consider non-figuration as an end in itself. She defends the idea that the artist should be able to choose their means freely without being trapped into the abstraction figuration opposition, and she wants a third way that she calls semi-abstraction. The idea is not to condemn the non-figurative realizations, and she recognizes great possibilities in these works in terms of linear creation, and she experiments that way from the 30s and more frequently in the 40s and 50s. But Janin does not renounce figuration. There's no shift. On the contrary, in parallel to experiments with cosmograms of her non-figurative oil paintings, where you got an example on the bottom, she continues to propose paintings where figurative and non-figurative motifs merge. And I use the term non-figurative because for Janin, abstraction and non-figuration are not exactly the same. Non-figuration is only one modality of abstraction. Abstraction is also a stylization and deformation of known shapes, but also refers to a more general meaning that abstraction is to abstract elements from nature. Three examples that show that Janin refuses to choose or will continue to mingle abstraction and figuration. We can see the coronation of water and fire from the early 40s, sinuous lines mingled with the body of the characters, covering the face of the kneeling character. The rhythm, submarine rhythm from the early 50s, where one recognizes shells, but they are interwoven in a network of lines, of curved lines, abstract lines, or vigilance from the early 60s that has the same principle. Let's move to Garcin. The presentation that Garcin makes in 1937 is the idea is to push abstract art away from mere non-figuration, and she wants an evolution of the abstract art towards an art of symbolic synthesis. The experiences in terms of abstraction, and for Janin, abstraction and non-figuration is the same, make it possible to turn towards figuration with a new eye, to renew, transform abstract art by including figurative elements, abolishing the border between abstraction and figuration, as she writes. These rapprochements would have been impossible before the experience of complete non-figurative art, but currently, thanks to the directing development of the latter, which tends to go beyond itself to create a new synthesis, the barrier that had been raised between the domain of figurative forms and non-figurative forms has been rendered useless. So her aspiration is clear and can be seen in her production of the 1930s that is sometimes non-figurative, like this Composition au point noir from 1933, or sometimes mixing figurative and non-figurative elements, as in Men and Machine from 1932. Jeanne and Garcin don't paralyze the debate on abstract configuration. They want to try to unite these two means and experiment that in their works. So the questioning accounts for an abstract scene that is hesitating between designations. And one can read in one of the cahiers, in one of the notebooks of abstraction creation, a sentence by Garcin: it, the visual language, can be or not be figurative. That is not the question.
Alors ensuite, je vais voir les deux derniers points de manière un petit peu plus rapide. L'argument
Go a little
principal
quicker
dominé
for the
par
last 2 points, but
troisième point que je
so
vais
the third point, the idea of the expressive function of art that we'll try to expose, and the idea we have the idea of a synthesis of the expression of abstraction with this that rests on a similar notion of the function of art and of painting. Painting needs to be the expression of the artist, as is shown by the quote by Garcin on the screen. The painting is the expression of thought that is not only made of abstract images, but also of figurative elements. One finds here a language of art, referring to the theory defended by Georges Roch in his book, What is Abstract Art? A History of Abstraction in Painting, that should then, far from being empty of significations, abstract research trying to load the means of painting through colors and lines, content signifies and signified, and one understands why these two artists use the word symbol as a central notion in a thought, symbolic, an art of a symbolic synthesis, as Garcin says. First, because the symbol refers to the field of semiotics, the idea of a language of art, colors and lines are the signs of ideas, of thoughts, but also because the symbol, as opposed to the sign, is not arbitrary but motivated. There is the rudiment of a natural bond, to quote, between idea and sign, to quote Saussure. For Jean Garcin, the goal is not to set up a personal language that which communication would need to be explained, and they're wary of that. The painting should not only express what's inside their thoughts, but that needs to be conveyed, communicated to the viewer. The idea is not to establish a language of art, but a universal language of art, as Jeanne says. And that universalism is justified by the idea of common forms, of common symbols to humankind, taking up ideas developed at the time in the fields of psychoanalysis and anthropology. The new symbolism opens on the fourth commonality between the artists. If the form of the symbol can be abstract, and if symbols belong to the universal of humankind, thus being part of a long history, then one can't be surprised to see Garcin and Janin defending a history of abstraction that's not only a modern movement, but a creation process that has accompanied the art history. So very quickly, a quote by Garcin: the so-called abstract art by time represents a form of that audacity, but doesn't mean that it is an inherent creation to our century and unknown throughout the history of art. On the contrary, that visual expression is old as the hills, and the fierce champions of that tendency make a pleasant error when they set up as inventors, the artists working in that direction. And Jana finds in the ornamental motifs of antique civilization, ancient civilizations, Native American, Celtic, or Oceanian, find traces of these formal experimentations. And she writes that if you go back to the source of modern abstraction, one can see it as a continuation of a mode that's been practiced since cavemen, be it ornamentation. So we far from the histories of abstract art as they were written after The War, or by Alfred Barr in 1936. Thus, thinking the history of abstract art by the rehabilitation of women artists seems to me a way to challenge some canonical narratives that are still significant. The study of studying the works and the writings of Janin and Garcin make it possible to rethink the formalist discourse of the 1930s, permeated by the questionings of that time, even though that period has been set aside by formalist canonical histories. Let's think of Michel Aragon's History of Abstract Art, published in 1956, that just mentions in passing the Cercle Carré and abstraction creation groups. One can think of Michel Sefort, who was involved in these groups, but in his exhibition of 1949, one insists on the 30s. And after the war, there's a historical ambition in the narrative, or in the writing of the narrative of abstract art. The idea is to insist of the importance of pioneers from the 1910s, Mondrian, Kandinsky, Malevich, Robert Delaunay, more than Sonia Delaunay or Kupka. And it's that rather than valuing contemporary research. So they do that, and then they value contemporary research from the 1950s, there again with a lot of men. That's also what Dora Valier will do in 1967 with a trio of pioneers, Kandinsky, Mondrian, and Malevich. Since chronology has been challenged and theory research have been integrated to abstract art, as shown the exhibition The Origins of Abstraction that took place in 2003 at the Orsay Museum. And in that sense, I'm thinking, and in that direction, I'm thinking of Ilma F. Klint, or Joanna Houghton, as Oriane Castel mentioned in her introduction. So there is another history of abstraction that is brought to light by these women artists that have been made invisible for too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion Sergent, for this very enlightening presentation, which shows us that Laure Garcin and Louise Janin set the terms of debates that continued well after the 1930s, and which also shows us that they were not just content about describing the artistic situation in which they were involved in, but that they both took a critical look at a certain conception of abstraction in order to defend another. This critical register made it possible to make the transition or the connection with the following presentation, which is entitled Sorority, Textile and Abstraction, the demonstrations Espace Cousu and Couture Peinture of Aline Dallier-Popper, 1976-1977. And Franny Tachon is going to present it to us now, and she is going to expose the way in which the art critic Aline Dallier-Popper theoretically accompanied the demonstrations of the group of women artists named Dialogue at the end of the 70s. To introduce her, Franny Tachon is currently preparing the curatorial competition and she has been in charge of research as the Service des Musées de France, and as such, she has elaborated the virtual exhibition Les Femmes Artistes sortent de leur réserve for the Ministry of Culture in 2019. She's also a graduate of École du Louvre, and her research paper was on exhibitions of the Dialogue Group. More specifically, it was entitled The First Three Events of the Dialogue Group, Women's Exhibition, What For? So she is a specialist of this group, and I will give her the floor so that she can present these events. Franny Tachon, the floor is yours. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Oriane Castel, for this introduction. I also want to thank the scientific committee for selecting my proposal and the Centre Pompidou for welcoming me today. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. And can you see the screen? Yes, perfect. Great. So I'm really delighted to be part of this PhD session and sharing my discoveries on Espace Cousu, Couture Peinture, on textile art and the Aline Dallier Popper in 76, 77. And to understand better this exhibition, I'm going to go back to 75. After a separation between the Hélène Berthaud collective, which was put together by Hélène Berthaud, the artist Christiane de Casteras' annual collective exhibitions entitled Femini in the premises of the UNESCO in Paris, following the example of other groups of artists active in the middle of the 70s, such as La Spirale, Femme Art, or Femme en Lutte. Dialogue seeks to fight against the invisibilization of the work of the creative women on the French artistic scene. Organizing following the UN resolution proclaiming 1975 as International Women's Year, the first event, Femini 75, brings together the works of nearly 80 women artists of all nationalities. It opens to the various plastic tendencies and exhibits paintings and sculpture as well as photography and architecture. Commenting this first edition in her article called Women's Exhibitions What For?, Aline Dallier Popper, pioneer of the feminist art critic in France, underlines the little interest of such a demonstration, which, although dedicated to the creative women, does not emphasize the social bonds that underpins the common condition of women. And yet, from the following year, art criticism becomes one of the artistic advertisers of the group dialogue. It is in this respect that she organizes, on the occasion of the two following editions, the exhibition dedicated to textile art entitled Espace Cousu 76 and Couture Peinture in 77, which thus become the first independent spaces dedicated exclusively to this medium within a salon. She conceives these manifestations as fields of practical application for her theoretical positions. And in the continuity of the research that she carries out for her thesis, of PhD in artistic aesthetics entitled Activities and Achievements of Women in Contemporary Art. At first, the works derived from traditional textile techniques or for articles that she publishes in artistic reviews as Opus International or Féministe Les Cahiers du Griffe en Sorcière, that Aline Dallier Popper imagines these events gathering about 20 women artists. Although some of them adopt a figurative language, the major part of these new Penelopes, as Aline Dallier Popper calls them, holds rather to the only use of forms and colors. However, to push the experimentation until the pure abstraction amounts to, according to the curator, to raise the artisanal or handicraft work of those women to the artistic dignity. Because by presenting abstraction productions as soft art, Aline Dallier Popper intends to revalorize these minorized and feminized techniques of sewing, which had been relegated to the rank of domestic spheres. By wishing to move the needlework from the bottom to the top of the scale of constituted values, she pursues to reverse these traditional hierarchies between crafts and fine arts. It will thus be questioned during this presentation devoted to the abstract textile art of reinterpreting the practices of sewing to the formal experimentations, but also subversions of the work of needle in favor feminist discourse. I'm going to begin by evoking the textile art as against avant-garde by taking back the expression of Aline Dallier Popper, which engages in the empowerment of the emancipation of the medium. Indeed, since the years 1960, a certain number of artists realized direct textile creations, that is to say, without mediation of a heddle, without recourse to the cardboard, not even sometimes to the loom. The technique of sewing art are thus revisited, even diverted, by the profit of an abstract aesthetic. The works presented in the exhibitions Féminine 676 and Fémini 76 are certainly realized according to various techniques of sewing, that is, the weaving, crochet, braided, plaited, macramé. And although there's a recourse to traditional know-how, they are qualified by Aline Dallier Popper of mixed media. Also, the textile works, far from being purely decorative works, are more similar to paintings, sculptures, or even installations. The artists escape thus to the usual categorizations of the history of art by seeking the decompartmentalization of the practices and by creating alternative ways. By this tendency to the transdisciplinarity, they develop textile works, protein works of art. Among these abstract textile world, it is necessary to, first of all, mention those which seem to be close to painting. It is advisable to quote the work of Cuban artist Hesse, settled in France in 1962, and close to various Parisian feminist groups, Dialogue Femmes en Lutte. Her work has already been presented by Aline Dali-Popper in New York in exhibition Combative Acts, Profiles, and Voices in 1976 at the Air Gallery, which was the first exclusively managed by women visual artists. The work exhibited in the Soon space of Femini 76 is one of her embroidered paintings from the series Grillage. You can notice horizontal lines that are repeated in a serial way on all the surface of an unbleached cotton canvas. This contemporary writing of the thread and the needle proceeds of a purely abstract plastic language, which tends to assimilate the textile work to a minimalist canvas. The economy of means and the geometry of the lines, the play between the full and the empty, come to put at evil the traditional imagery of an archaic and decorative embroidery. It is these same formal characteristics that we find in the abstract textile work of the American Emily Fuller. In her work, the pieces of fabrics are sewn between them with the machine. The various geometric forms are assembled between them by thread, but they're unified by the paint as a layer of color covers the entire piece. These two types of works, finally close stylistically, although different technically, are interpreted by Aline Dali-Popper as fibrous facts that reveal the structural quality of textile. This emphasis of the material is found in another type of diverted textile practice defended by Aline Dali-Popper and presented in the Femini exhibitions. It is about the new tapestry, which corresponds to an international trend in textile art in the 60s. To conceive this type of work, the artist mixed traditional techniques produced on the loom and other new ones realized out of the loom, without the loom. They imagine no more than two-dimensional pieces to hang on a wall, but three-dimensional productions would enter in relation with the space. According to Aline Dali-Popper, these abstract textile works are no longer conceived as isolated objects, but as part of the environment. This change of scale and the shift from the tapestry to installations are particularly visible in the photographs visible in the catalogue Femini 77, which shows the French artist Marie-Claude Quignon installing one of her monumental compositions on the wall of her studio. But it is especially with the work of two plastic artists from Eastern Europe that I would like to illustrate this argument. First of all, the Polish artist Magdalena Abakanowicz, who since 1961 has been started making from natural fibers wool, hemp, linen, sisal, large, flexible sculptures baptized by a Polish critic, Abakans, after her family name, the family name of the artist. At first flight, her monumental works develop little by little, embossed, then in volume. Her tapestries are, according to Émilie Bouvard, linked to the eccentric abstractions such as theorized by Lucie Lippard in 1966 because of the visual, tactile, and visceral qualities. Her works, such as the black abacan kept at the Centre Pompidou or the red abacan presented at Femini 77, testify of a research on the organic, and they can, in my opinion, be brought closer to the abstract textile pieces of the Croatian artist Jagoda Buick, exhibited at Femini 75 and 76. The research led by the artist since 1959 around a spatial tapestry starting from natural materials testify of the same preoccupations for the plastic properties of the soft and the problems of structure. These questions fall under the continuity of the reflections of Jagoda Buick around space, because the artist was trained in the studios of the Cinecittà in Rome, then worked for the Croatian National Theatre in making sets and costumes. By using the technique of tapestry, these two artists appropriates the ancestral and artisanal transition. Thus, Jagoda Buick states, "In my country, the peasant women weave while singing." She also evokes at several occasions the fates, these three spinner sisters of the destiny of men in the ancient Roman mythology. However, if they are part of this long heritage of sewing, usually transmitted from mother to daughter, from generation to generation, these two plastic artists managed to detach themselves from the tradition. And it is precisely for this reason that Aline Dali-Popper decided to exhibit their work, because their works, while being registered in a heritage, seek to thwart it by diverting the techniques of sewing by bringing the textile closer to other mediums, and especially by having recourse to abstraction. It is in this sense that the exhibitions Espace Cousu and Couture Peinture participate in a transgression of the medium, in a subversion of the artistic canon. For as Griselda Pollock and Rosika Parker explain it, the canon as a structure of subordination and domination contributed to devalue systematically the textile technique, traditionally associated with domestic activities and stereotypical qualities such as concentration, meticulousness, precision, and patience. This medium, usually attached to the so-called minor arts, which could encourage women to conform to a certain feminine model, is ultimately an instrument of expression and revolt that amounts to make of the textile a counter-knowledge, since an object of submission. It becomes a tool of feminist claim. It is thus this idea that the sewing can become a weapon, more or less sharpened against patriarchal authority, expression that I borrowed from Aline Dadi Popper, that I would like to develop from now on. Because if the artists of the year 1970 reinvest these techniques, or so-called feminine techniques, it is precisely to dissociate themselves from a dominant masculine culture and to carry out a reflection on their own socio-historical conditions. About the exhibition's Femini Aline Dadi Popper work, I did not seek in any case to show feminine works, but rather feminized works, linking to our history of confinement, situated between subjection and revolt. Needlework could provide today to the women who devote themselves to it the occasion to analyze their oppression and their sexual repression and lead them to creation. And this is in particular what the artists who practice anti-embroidery, such as defined by Aline Popper in an article published by the feminist magazine Sorcière. It is a question of transforming the embroidery into a kind of assembly by the addition of objects in relief on the textile. The work of Liliane Camier, exhibited at Femini 76, illustrates this practice. This French artist, close to various feminist groups, realizes here what she calls an object poem or poem object. She sews on a canvas background transparent plastic pockets containing various elements, locks of her children's hair, pieces of paper scribbled with a pen, feathers, food, sewing objects, or even dried flowers. All these charms, as the designer calls them, more or less related to the domestic universe, are embroidered on the fabric to ward off the bad luck done to women, according to Aline Dadi Popper. Well, abstract in its composition, since made only of forms and colors, this work, however, leans on the reality of everyday life of women, in that it is compared with the work of Milvia Maglone, who develops what Aline Dadi Popper qualifies of poetic of domestic, also exposed in Espace Cousu, Soon Space of 1976, is lessons of embroidery juxtaposes on a gray felt background, miniature sewing accessories, tiny samples of embroidery stitches and embroidery stitches and discs cut out on canvas and held by pin, as well as colored silk threads and colored silk, through the succession of shapes and lines, more or less geometric. Milvia Maglione evokes the craft of sewing associated with maternal and domestic values. Her first work, entitled Dedicated to Eld, preserved at the Pompidou Center, already made reference by its beads and ribbons to the reference by its pearls and to the world of the seam. While Beaucoup d'heures de travail, exhibited at Femini 77, is more reminiscent of the world of the kitchen, with its tiny utensil seams to stripped fabric. Aline Dadi Popper has compared these textile works to forms of contemporary ex-voto, seeing in her assemblage possible banners made by women to celebrate Feast of the Virgin Mary in the region of Puglia, where Milvia Maglione is from. Also, these paintings would be similar to paintings for altars of contemporary women. For in her, Milvia Maglione used techniques to express current concerns. The women artists can join to the traditional pictorial media, the typical media for her own, for example, the needle, the thread, the pin, and to radiograph thus in depth this own anxieties and emotion. By evoking them, it is an abstract way to seek and to bring to light work of women and make recognized their tasks, such as the kitchen, the housework, or the maternity and motherhood, and they are present in Raymond Darcier's work exhibited at Femini 76 and 77. If we know her figurative work particularly well represented at the Pompidou Center, with In the Name of the Father, Women Crucified to the and Sexual Tasks, her abstract work also testifies of the same feminist confirms by realizing a long and difficult work of knitting according to the techniques that her mother taught her when she was a child. Raymond Darcier treats the household work on the mode of the shifted to measurement of the undergone oppression. Thus, its game of checkers is her game of checkers is carried out starting from the arrangements in square of 80 dirty mops and 8 clean mops. This abstract work, which takes the shape of a geometrical grid, is however extracted from its daily newspaper of woman, which he diverts here in an ironic, subversive way. This work can be compared to Jeanne Coquet's Farewell to Tears, exhibited at Femini 77, since the abstract tapestry is made from fabrics, made from the artist that she recovers in a public dump. She recovered in a public dump of the Vaucluse. Like Raymond Arcier, Jeanne Soquet seeks to create from the worn, the tired, the discarded, the despised, even of the dirty, polluted, soiled, and finally the loaded of the past. It is another idea that Raymond Arcier tries to develop in her own work, Occlusion intestinale, and research of feminine masculine and feminine masculine, also exposed in the space swing painting space Femini 77. So she crocheted a foam stitch for nearly 2 years, several kilos of brass to make this large flexible structure. If she considers brass to be a man's material, which she wishes to transform with her needles, she calls them women's weapons. In a text written on the occasion of the show, she describes this intermingling of forms, which she identifies with the dead ends, crossings, prohibited directions, slopes, and colors of the urban life. She relates also in this text the hostile impression that gives her city occupied by men only, that she opposes to the very dear protective walls of her house. She thus associates the space interior with the female and one, and on the contrary, the external space with the male one. She thus seeks to reappropriate it by the artistic work of sewing a space annexed by men. She uses her needles to fray the established order. According to the expression of Aline Dallier-Topper, the work thus invites by its forms, its material, and its technique to transgress gender standards. To conclude, by defending the diversity of techniques, styles, and strategies adopted by women artists in the artistic field, she opposes to an essentialist reading of the world in the creative women. And it is in particular what she tries to demonstrate in the exhibition Espace Cousu, Couture Peinture, in view of the variety of works presented, that they are similar to painting, sculptures, or assemblage, that they carry a claim of poetic subject. All these abstract pieces contribute to make of the textile art an artistic medium to whole share free from its utilitarian and functional functions, which come to subvert the artistic canon of the time. I thank you for listening. I wish you a good session.
Cette communication très intéressante qui a le mérite, entre autres choses, d'insister à nouveau sur l'importance de l'accompagnement théorique, puisque vous l'avez dit, l'usage du terme mixed média par Aline Dallier-Popper contribue à rendre légitimes les pratiques textiles du groupe Dialogue, c'est-à-dire que l'accompagnement théorique participe d'une reconnaissance artistique du travail des créatrices de leur vivant. Et cet aspect nous offre une transition vers la communication suivante, puisqu'on la retrouve problématisée d'une autre manière dans le sujet que va aborder Lou Forster. En effet, à travers sa communication dans ses incorporer l'abstraction dans la Lucida Child Dance Company.
In his presentation, Dancing Page in Hand, Embodying Abstraction, the Lucida Child Dance Company, we will explain the notation systems that have been implemented by the Lucida Child's choreographer. And it's a way to position oneself in art history. Lou Foster is a PhD student at the Hautes Études des Sciences Sociales with Karine Verbetti from Harvard. and he's been working on the Child's Dance Company and organized a solo exhibition at the Centre National de la Danse in Pantin in 2016. It was again shown at the Scène Nationale d'Orléans in 2018, and Lou is also accompanying the donation of the archives of the choreographer at the Centre National de la Danse. He's a real specialist down here in the floor. Thank you, Oriane, for that introduction, and I want to join the thanks that have been formulated by the two previous presenters, to the Scientific Council, to the Centre Pompidou, to the Legs Laboratory for the organizing of that event. And I'm very impatient to discover the exhibition that I haven't been able to see yet. I'll start by sharing my PowerPoint. It should work. Because a remote symposium is not conducive to the presentation of moving images. So I'll start by giving a short description of calico mingling, the first piece of the Lucien Charles Quartet, presented on the 7th of December 1973 at the Whitney Museum. Sitting on chairs, on the floor, or standing, the audience creates an 11 meter square in one of the rooms of the museum. The four performers get to 4 marks on the floor. They're 120 centimeters apart and create 2 lines facing the same direction. After a while, Lucinda Childs, who's on the right-hand side, gives an impulse. She spreads her arms, and that brief, precise, and calm gesture enables them to be in unison. The dancers start walking forward. The soles of their shoes sound on the wooden floor in a rapid tempo that the choreographer calls slightly eclectic. After 6 steps, the organization of the group gets more complex. Each makes half an arc in a different direction, towards the right or towards the left. And while they're moving on parallel lines, they move away, move closer or across. The straight lines and the arcs are spread between performers, and direction or the way they're facing varies. It leads the performers to cover that square without ever meeting, and sometimes emerge in the dance parallelism symmetries that disappear and reappear elsewhere. After 3 minutes, the 4 dancers go back to the marks at the beginning of the dance in an order and facing a different direction. They have just completed the choreographic phrase of calico mingling. They will do 4 times in different special configurations. That quartet ends the first concert of dance of the Lucien Charles Dance Company. Even more than other pieces presented in that opening night, it exposes the choreographic principles that Charles worked with. The vocabulary of walking, the continuous rhythm of ostinato, the straight line, and the semi on the half circle of floor patterns, limited number of variations, the orientation of the performers, the directions of the movements. So retrospectively, the dance historian Sally Baines sees calico mingling as one of the emblems of the analytical turn that part of the American dance operates in the early 70s, with the depersonalization and objectivation that leads the focus of spectators on the structures of movement in itself. Repetition, seriality, modularity can be are close to minimal or conceptual art, and with which Lucinda Charles has a close dialogue at the time with artists like Sol Lewitt, Robert Morris from Epoch. But if we look at the performance of the body, one sees another dance filmed a few months after the Whitney Museum evening by Babette Mangold. Chemical Mingling presented 4 dances on the Robert Moses Square in Manhattan. When they initiate the first bar of the dance, one is struck by the diversity of the way they perform that walk. On the left, Judy Pado swings symmetrically her arms and shoulders with her body leaning forward. Susan Brody and Nancy Fuller in the middle move at the same time, move their arm at the same time as the opposite leg. And they amplify the contralateral pattern of walking on the right hand side. It's a child, the torso a little stiff. There's an irregular movement of the arm that shows an impulse at the beginning of each bar. These six first steps show the complexity that is inherent to the first steps of a company. Charles, it marches, but Brody and Fuller progress, and Pado moves forward. 3 kinesthetic signatures, 3 ways to move in the world that express something else than the pure movement to which the work of the choreographer has recurrently been associated from 1973. Chemical Mingling has 2 interpretations coexisting, 2 dancing coexisting, that unfold as many distinct planes and dimensions, floor patterns and their embodiments, the lower and upper body, weight transfers and gestures. And that dualism is at the heart of the collaboration of the choreographer with Bertrand Gold, whose film alternates 2 types of images. One wide-angle shot that captures dancers from the front, and an aerial view taken from one of the Fulham University buildings that overlooks the square. And this enables us, that shot enables us to see the planimetric dimension of the floor patterns and to see the motive of the grid pattern that the dancers follow. And insist on the layering of the dance with the low dance, abstract and objective, and high dance, expressive and subjective. What I'm trying to do in this presentation is to show the original sources and the specific historical configuration that impose a path in the choreographic practice research arts. That medium enables her to implement objectivation and depersonalization. It invites to a new form of sharing between embodiment of dance and choreography. Lucinda Charles has said several times that she had no technique. Even if that assertion can be disputed, it shows an important change in her approach to dancing. In the States, the second generation of choreographers, modern choreographers in the 20s and 30s, consider technique as the heart of the dance practice. Daily drills enable the dancer to acquire the syllabus, the movements and motor reflexes specific to techniques that took the name of choreographers like Graham, Limon, or Humphrey Weidman. In 1973, Charles proposes to create dance movement through other means, and chemical mingling is the first attempt. Inscriptions and writings take the central place that was devoted to technique. From 1993, Charles organizes the dances through floor plans, and that symbolic form is part of the long history of movement notation systems. It's one remembers Pierre Beauchamp and Raoul Auger-Feuillet in the 18th century that invented a notation system that spread to the whole of Western Europe. and classical ballet masters subject the part to a very refined semiotics with the floor plan, or the graphic representation of the floor plan, the floor pattern or the trace, the drawing produced by the dancer when they move, and the movement, the actual movement of the dancer that is referred to as the path. The development of modern dance is marked by a negative prejudice regarding that representation of movement. It's inspired by the modernist argument echoed by John Martin in Modern Dance in 1933. He reproaches the flatness that doesn't account for the height, which is crucial to represent jumps, but also to account for gravity, an essential factor of movement that is central to modern dance. So floor plans are relegated to a subaltern figuration of movement because the dance movement is not seen as in spatial terms, more as a play of forces, contraction release, for Martha Graham, fall and recovery for Humphrey, for instance. At the heart of modernism, those two matrices of abstraction and dancing are brought together by Arch Lauterer, who was an architect, a light designer, a festival director, a teacher as well, close to Graham, Humphrey, Holm, and Weinman. His work played a considerable part in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and he was the subject of a solo exhibition at the MoMA in 1946. His approach of floor plans influenced development of that technique by Childs to construct the lights and sets of the shows that he worked on. Lauterer used floor plans to analyze the movements of dancers in space and the structural lines of a piece. At the crossroads of dancing and architecture, he values the reduction to movement to one dimension that corresponds to his specific needs. In the book published by Limitation on Martha Graham, some of his drawings are reproduced and his method is described. Quote, during the summer 1933, Arch Lauterer followed the lines of some of Martha Graham's best-known dances. The sketches were made in half darkness, and while Mr. Lauterer was watching the dance without the opportunity to check his line against the dancer's movement. Yet, even in this way, they make a portrait of both the dancer, and the dancer is clear, free, and modern. They point the way ahead. Lauterer's floor plans capture an invisible dimension to dance that is retranscribed by the tactile stimulus of pen and paper. Insofar as he can't see what he's doing in the semi-darkness of the theatre, the tracé reveals a hidden dimension of dance that is independent on composition, the rational organization of movements in space and time. Lauterer moves away from the geometrical and ornamental dimension that prevail in floor plans to find an unconscious dimension that can be associated to the graphic act of the time, the serpentine, angular, mazy lines they translate the ecstasis, the essential affect of modern dance produced by the encounter with space that is dynamized by kinesthetic energy. It is the first metamorphosis experienced by the symbolic form of the floor plan and in contact with choreographic modernity. Now, if we move to 1973, in the portfolio published by Lucille Childs in Art Forum a few months before the presentation of Chemical Mingling, the first set of floor plans realized by the choreographer can be seen there. They illustrate the soli that she has created at Johnson Dance Theatre in the 60s. The choreographer appropriates not only the planimetric representation of movement, but also the graphic style of Lauterer, a line with arrows from freehand. Her encounter with the Lauterer's drawings happens when Charles studies at the St. Lawrence College between 61 and 63. Lauterer was running the theatre department there until 58 when he died. And when Charles studied there, the dance department was headed by someone who is very close to Lauterer, Bessie Schoenberg. The use of floor plans for child rests on the tactile and incremental dimension of drawing, something that was highlighted by Lautre. But for Lautre, the drawing is a scene of writing when he's in the doctor theatre and he leaves his hand to transcribe automatically the movements. For Charles, it is the instrument of a recollection of documentation. The process is accompanied by the collection of photographs by Hans Namlock and Peter Moore that are reproduced in the article. And the part is also cut up in several segments that correspond to the different sequences of the piece. In Portfolio, a new articulation between dancing and graphical art, where the floor plan and make it possible to call upon the memory of a kinesthetic experience and to turn the drawing into an objective analysis. In Charles uses the floor plans for the first time in 1973 to rehearse with the members of the company. And in the archives that the choreographer has given to the Centre National de la Danse, one finds numerous copies of a photocopy, an A4 photocopy, that details the floor plan of each of the performers. And it's not a freehand drawing, it's been made with rulers, compasses, or templates. And a number of technical informations like title, author, date have been added. It's a document that was made for the internal use of the company, and a reader that would be uninformed would not be able to tell where the movement starts or in what direction to follow it. So because it was so difficult to read, I use a different approach, an interdisciplinary approach where literary studies and observatory and participant observation have enabled me to see how that document was used in the dance studio by the members of the company. In the jargon of the company, the document is called a reduction. It's been produced by the miniaturization of the master thanks to a photocopier. The documents kept by the choreographer enables to recreate the 7 stages necessary to that fabrication of the document. The aim of that chain of writing for the choreographer was to create a document which can literally be handheld and with which dancers can dance. Starting from that form of reading, so the handheld document, one can understand the abstract elements that compose the floor plans. Each dancer reads one of the choreographic phrases placed, and they see the full lines that define a walking forward and broken lines walking backwards. Each segment corresponds to a bar of 6 beats and 6 steps. The dance is made of 6 sections, and each section is separated one above the previous one. Thus, the layout doesn't represent a spatial continuity like a map, but a temporal succession. To visualize the path of calico mingling, one has to walk in the studio. At the end of each section, at bars 8, 16, their eyes jump up to the next section. Then they keep reading, that is, walking and dancing. The checkbox facilitates that jump at the beginning of each section. Later, the choreographer will use a cinematic representation of movement where each bar is represented independently in a grid. And the link with the drawings of Soloit is obvious. But what Calico Mingling invents is a new link between the floor plan and the dance movement. In the portfolio, the drawing enabled the dancer to remember a past movement in the quartet. It enables the dancer to memorize and embody the past. So it is something that includes the internal memory of performers, the reduction in hand, and the master on the floor. And it's the coordination of these internal and external representations that facilitate the rehearsal. And that culture of the writing within the child's company proposes a new form of embodiment of dancing. Throughout the rehearsals, dancers develop technical skills that enable them to be in the space of the page and in the space of the studio, in reading and in dancing. That double focus creates a specific awareness of movement. Then what can see in the footage of the play of the piece by Babette Mangold. And it's described by the choreographer as something that is away from any point of view. Finally, I want to try to see how that practice of reading comes from the contact of the choreographer with the German diaspora in the 1960s. That link that's been ignored by historiography that has preferred the narrative of modern and postmodern dance that's autonomous from its European relatives, enables us to understand more deeply the place of abstraction in the work of the child's company. The use to choreographical scores shows the influence of a form of studio work that the choreographer discovers between 55 and 61 when she studies with Hanya Holm. In 1930, following the American tour of the German choreographer Mary Wigman, the German choreographer asks one of her dancers, Anya Holm, to open a Wigman school in New York. Anya Holm will teach there until 1983, and the school becomes a meeting place for the German diaspora in New York. Instead, that lab annotation was Americanized. It was a movement notation system developed by Rudolf Laban, the Austro-Hungarian choreographer. In 1939, Helen Priest, Eve Gentry, Jenny Price, and Hannah Hutchinson Guest created the Dance Notation Bureau, an association that promotes and develops that system in the States. When Childs, as a teenager, enters the school, habilitation is not taught there, but the syllabus is influenced by a Wigmano-Labanian approach, and occasionally during lessons, students had to decipher scores or cut papers on the floor, especially for special scales. On the staff, because lamentation is something that can be read with the page in hand, on the staff, time is organized vertically from bottom to the top, which is unique in the different movement notation systems. And one is that the calico mingling floor plans reproduce an organization of time that is identical. And although the graphical forms that Charles uses are very different from lab annotation, these scores can be seen as palimpsests that transpose the materiality and certain graphic characteristics of the system that she has studied at the end of the 50s. The choreographer appropriates work situations discovered 20 years earlier. More fundamentally, it seems to me that the rapport between Childs and the dance techniques resonates with Holmes' teaching. During the lessons, the students work with analytical concepts like directions, orientations, weight levels, weight transfers. And it's different to the way that ballet or modern dance was taught in America, where classes were organized through drills. So when Child says she has no technique, echoes the way North American dancing perceived the Ausdruck dance from Germany, but it echoes also the deep personalization and depth of the author that marks the minimal and conceptual art. And also, Charles hasn't developed a syllabus, and she used or approached a number of styles, classical, Baroque, and so forth. She uses German dance to analyze, embody, and appropriate these vocabularies thanks to the floor plans and to the ingenuity of given by that representation of the movement. Charles' versatility that has been approached under the prism of postmodernism also comes under an unprecedented meeting between different cultures of dance. And finally, it's a way to place the heart of Charles the embodiment of the work by dancers. And I see the first quarter of Charles, two parallel histories that have been separated. And her graphic techniques correspond to repetition, seriality, modularity, developed by minimal art. But this does not enable one to understand the way that the dance company works to embody this. So I want to try to advocate for the complexity of that discourse history that is bringing to closer the historiography of modern dance and of postmodern dance and different moments of European and North American abstractions, and enables us to move away from national context, from movements and tendencies that have been obsessing the historians and art historians in the context of the Second World War and the Cold War. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having showed us and discussed these partitions by child. The reading you have done really show a definition of abstraction between that juggles objective abstract vocabulary with subjective expressiveness. In this sense, child's practice also seems to participate in a questionings of canonical narratives, to use Marion Sergent's expression, or subverting the artistic canon, to use Franny Tachon's. The taking into account of this discipline, that is the dance, allows in this case, the work of complexification of the conception of abstraction that we propose to make during these days. And I thank you for this presentation. I will now give the floor to the listeners, to the audience, or rather I will relay their questions. And I will start by reading the questions that were asked during the presentations. It's for Franny Tachon. Today, there is a look at on textile in art, but I believe that about theory, there hasn't been any evolution since the 70s in the interpretations of the use of these mediums, empowerment, etc. I also think that the analysis is partial because in Lyon, there has been textile, or Britons also have used it as well. And what about sending systematically back to gender and to this meeting? I think these problematics are not at the heart of the work and productions. Thank you for your thoughts on this question. Thank you very much for this question. Of course, my analysis and in this communication was just partial on abstract textile art. It was what Aline Dallier-Popper said, and there are other museum exhibitions that came back on these topics. Griselda Pollock mentioned yesterday the exhibit Abstraction in Textile Art at the Beaux-Arts in Brussels that took place in the year 2000, I believe, or more recently, Décorum, Tapis et Tapisserie, and in 2014. And these two manifestations were were presented men and women. So I didn't look at the first catalog, but in the second, Andressen, in one of the articles, came back on the work of the silk people specialized in silk in Lyon, or the Britons and their work as well. So there is a special dedicated place for textile art presenting Madalena Bakanovitz, Jagoda Buick, which I mentioned, but also Sheila X. And in the catalog, the analysis that is made of these works rely more on formal questions or historic ones more than feminist ones. So I believe that this can open new leads, new paths to avoid reading it only based on gender. Thank you very much for your answer. And we have another comment, or that is for you, Franny. It is a suggestion by Elena Di Rado, who writes, who thanks you, first of all, for the presentation and wants to say that the Italian artist Cuervo, who used pigments in her environmental installations in the 70s, is also would be of interest for you. I don't know if you know this artist, but she suggested it for her. And there's another question. Now it is for Marion Sergent. What are the relationships between Louise Janin and the Philosophical Society? I think I saw these references in the works that were presented. Yes, it was about Mondara, who is a work that was acquired by the Theosophical Society in 24. It is still there. If you go to the Theosophical Society in Paris, it's not in good conditions, but it's still up on the wall. And it is she was an artist, Janin, who in the archives, I found a number of catalogs of her art being shown in esoterical places. And it is not surprising because she belonged to the musicalist group, which appears, and among them, a number of artists were in connection with esoterical societies like Eudia, who read the works by Besson, Ellen Better, and so there's a true connection to make between them. And all the texts, we feel the weight of spirituality and the esoterical sources, which are extremely present. Thank you very much. I don't see any further question in the conversation, so please do not hesitate to ask them. I would have a question for you, Franny Tachon, in the same spirit as the previous one. Marion Sergent tackled the symbol in the works she presented. So during dialogue, as you said, you showed that these artists showed assemblage of traces, concrete traces in their work, and the abstract grid, which became a chess game. So it's the hypothesis that in abstraction, the most efficient way to have add political views also. It is very present in the members of the dialogue group also, but I was wondering if when we think of the work, we weren't putting at risk the way of putting women in a special place, whereas men would have an ability to project themselves and conceive elsewhere, somewhere else. And so you told us that Aline Dallier-Popper wasn't in an essentialist path, but was she conscious of the risk and eventually the way in which she responded? So yes, thank you very much for this question. It is true that all along her career, Aline Dallier-Popper was confronted to this problematic of theoretization of gender, and she was the only one to think about this and mention it at the time in France. And so there were more American theoreticians who tackled the problem, and she worked with them. So she knew she knew Aline Banoclin, she knew Lucille Park, Griselda Pollock's work as well. And in France, namely in her thesis, which is kept in Rennes and at the University of Paris 8, I was able to take a look at it. She talks about the problematic of essentialism and the difficulty to overcome it by working on textile art. And she added that she didn't want to contribute to this image of women's work only and domestic tasks. And it is very surprising because in her path, in her journey, you can see that after the 70s, she moves away from the woman artist, and she's this vision on women artists, but she moves away from it. But I'm thinking of her work on minimal art, namely, and on work on Jean Dubuffet, Nicolas de Staël. And in the last interviews she gave at the end of her life, she said she didn't want to speak about these gender issues and not formulate an opinion anymore. So I believe that she came to maybe not then, but she didn't know how to position herself when she was solicited to take part and to conferences, and she always declined the offers and the invitations. I don't know. I hope I answered your question. Yes, absolutely. It's very interesting because we see that other questions can be asked as well. And I'm trying to look at the screen at the same time to see if any questions are coming in. I don't see any further questions. So I'll continue with my own question. And you can each one another react to each other's points and questions if you like to. So Lou Forster is saying, yes, I'd like to react to the question that you just asked to Franny Tachon. The first thing is that I was very happily surprised by the echo between our two presentations since the piece Comico Mingling, which I focused my work on, has a textile echo with the metaphor, or at least with the title. We're using this textile work, calico, and it's linking it to the abstract choreography that was developed at the time. And it is an exceptional case, of course, in the work of Lucinda Childs, because it is not something that we will find in the future work. But this textile model, or less conceptually, there's a stylization that she evokes in New York at the gallery. But concerning Lucinda Childs, it is true that in the 70s emerges a strong criticism of the place of sexual differences in feminist theories, and I'm thinking namely of De Loretti's work. There's an emergence also of a queer theory, which will reflect on questions feminism with other bases. Yes, absolutely. Have you finished what you wanted to say? Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, absolutely. And I have a question also for you, Lou Forster, for this question of grid, which I mentioned when speaking of Franny Tachon's presentation, and the subversion of the grid. And Child used the grid as a way to move on the ground, time to move on the ground. But what about real objects? There's an expressive aspect to be added if I use your vocabulary. And she subverts the objectivity thanks to objectivity. But if I well understood the process, she creates a dance that follows the regular organization of the grid form with the top of the body, very free movements. And the choice of this grid, which is as a symbol, we can see it in collective imagination, sends back to prison, jail, imprisonment, and being entrapped. And I wonder if all of these dances were created with the same plan on the ground. So the model, this grid model, appeared at different occasions in her work. And of course, in Calico Mingling, very clearly by the choice of Babette Mangold and Robert Moses in Manhattan had during the design, during the creation, this grid, it is something that we find in 79 with Sol Lewitz, since the film he co-directed for the play uses also a grid on the ground. What is very interesting is the way in which Lucinda Childs tackles or talks about this shape. And she uses it especially as a landmark to from going from a page to space and moving from one to another, you need to index space. And therefore the grid in 1974 or 79 was useful for her as a landmark rather than moving from one space to the other. So rather than a subversion, I think that the way in which she speaks about it, because the quote that I have is she talked about decentralizing, or which is essential of the spectator, of the audience, but also the art dancer. So this shows and echoes in a certain way to this critique of sexual difference. I believe women are also decentered, so to speak, and as De Laurentiis spoke about it. And I think that it is this question more than a subversion that is interesting to her. I thank you very much. We have a last question for you. I say last because I see we're running out of time, unfortunately, but Lou Forster, your research work, has it shed light on the participation and the way in which Lucinda Childs did her work? Or Lucinda Childs mentioned it in an interview that I conducted the interview in 2016 for the exhibition at the Dance National Center, and it was a paradoxical relationship since she knew about it, but at the same time, it was not really taught at the time. So it is an existing model, but not entirely integrated or taught to students at the home school at the end of the 50s. So this is why in my presentation, I explained that it is about making yours, adopting materiality, this page with which you dance page in hand. And this work situation, each dancer had a page and individually worked with others. So the page is a mediation between the different dancers. And palimpsest, since there are some graphical properties of the system that are found once again in the way in which Lucinda Childs work on her choreography in 73. So it is a motivation of sorority, of sisterhood, which is very complex because it is there's a transfer which is done, but not everything is transferred, and the graphic model. Thank you. As I said, unfortunately, we will have to close this session now, and I'd like to thank all of the people present and listening. I also want to thank you for your questions, and I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of the people who animated Christine Bolleron, also who supported me during the preparation of this session. I'd like to thank our interpreters, Una and Yves, who helped everyone follow these discussions, these to these events, Fabrice François and all the others. Thank finally Marion Sergent, Franny Tachon, and Lou Forster for having accepted the invitation and shared their research with us. It was very interesting on the medium, the space, different geographies, which are complementary in the way that they question the canons of abstraction to which we are used to. And Lou Foster talked about decentering, and I also thank you for these first steps towards a wider definition of abstraction. We will continue this thinking tomorrow, but I would like to invite all of those present today to subscribe to the session tomorrow, which will take place from 2 o'clock to morning. And this afternoon, we are also continuing and start at 2 o'clock. I wish you a very good and studious afternoon, and I thank you for your attentive presence this morning. Thank you very much.